I'm gonna build a tiny home in my backyard and bring you along for the entire process. After carefully planning and marking out the spot where we would build this tiny home, we picked up some concrete deck blocks and started to level them out. For the foundation of this tiny home, we're using pressure treated 2x6s and setting them into the grooves of the deck blocks until they're perfectly level. Once all the 2x6s were perfectly level, we took a tape measure from corner to corner to make sure that it would be perfectly square. We then screwed and nailed it together and marked where all the rest of the 2x6s would go at 16 and center. We crowned all the 2x6s and used 3.5-inch exterior screws to put them together. After all the 2x6s were in place, I reinforced each one using 3-inch framing nails, then added joist hangers for additional support to make sure this tiny home would last as long as possible. To insulate the subfloor of this tiny home, I picked up some 1/2-inch foam insulation that has an R value of 5, which isn't super crazy, and since it doesn't get super cold where I live, this amount of insulation should be sufficient for this tiny home. I cut the insulation so it fits in between the 2x6s, then use spray foam to seal it up the best that I can. I drilled small holes into the insulation to allow any excess moisture to escape, just in case it gets stuck in between the vapor barrier and the insulation. Then cut off all the excess spray foam before installing this 6mm plastic wrap that will work as my vapor barrier. I laid a bead of adhesive around all the edges before installing my subfloor, and for the subfloor I'm using 3/4-inch tongue and groove OSB. And I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for not staggering these OSB boards, but I really didn't feel there was a need to because this platform's exactly 8 feet wide, and all the joints have a direct point of contact underneath, which will allow this subfloor to last a really long time in my opinion. So I went ahead and secured them into place using 2-inch nails and a bunch of screws. And just like that, we have a solid subfloor that's level and square that we can build our tiny home on top of. The next day, it was time to do some framing, so I picked up a bunch of 2x4s and started assembling the wall frames on top of the platform I made yesterday. For spacing, I'm doing 16 in center and securing them using 3.5-inch screws, then coming back and hammering in 3-inch nails. I used the chalk line to mark where I'll be adding all my blocking, then basically just repeated the same process until all my framing was done. The guy you see helping me out in this video's name is Tom. He's one of the neighbors that comes by every once in a while to help me out, and when you're doing things like framing, it helps a lot to have an extra hand to do all the heavy lifting. And also shout out to my wife for helping me do all these crazy projects. After 2 solid days of framing, it was finally time to put up the walls. The front side of this tiny home is going to be 10 feet tall and the back side being 8 feet tall, which will make it feel much bigger on the inside. Once we got all of our framing up, we made sure that they were as square and as level as possible. Then we screwed them together to try to make this tiny home as rigid as possible. The next day, it was time to install the rafters, so I got up on a ladder with a 2x6 and started to measure out where I would be cutting out my bird's mouth. And what I'm basically doing is making a template that I can lay on top of all of my rafters to try and make them all the same so I have a nice consistent flat roof. Once we had our measurement, we spent the next hour and a half tracing and cutting out the rest of our rafters. Then we marked 16 in center and screwed them into place using 3.5-inch screws. Once all the rafters were in place, we picked up joist hangers and nailed one to each rafter. The next step was to add sheathing to the exterior of this tiny home, and we're using 1/2-inch OSB. And we're using these little clips to space out the OSB just enough so they can expand and contrast. Once we finished covering the entire tiny home and sheathing, it was time to finish up the roof. So we installed the rest of our joists that are overhang on the side of the house. The overhang on this tiny home will be 3 feet in the front, 10 inches on the sides, and 1.5 feet in the back. To secure everything in this tiny home, we've been using 3.5-inch screws, then coming back with nails to make this tiny home as rigid as possible, but also allow it to flex a little bit if it needs to. Now that all the framing for the roof is done, it's time to cover it in plywood. So we got a bunch of sheets onto the roof and then screwed them together, making sure all the edges have something to rest on. We also used a bunch of subfloor adhesive to help secure them down as tightly as possible. Once we finished up with the sheathing, we went ahead and added a drip edge around the entire perimeter of the roof and added a few nails every 10 inches or so. We just checked the weather and it's supposed to rain tomorrow night, So we gotta hustle and finish up the roof and all the house wrap so we can waterproof this thing. So let's go. Before adding the shingles, I'm installing the sticky waterproof wrap, which seals itself if there's some type of nail hole in it to make sure this roof doesn't leak. Now that the roof wrap is on, it's time to install some shingles. And I've never installed a roof before, but after doing a ton of research on YouTube, it seems pretty easy. I'm doing a stair-step pattern and putting 6 nails into each shingle, then repeating the same process over and over again until my roof is complete. And while I install this roof, I'll talk to you about this video sponsor, which is a trusted VPN company called Surfshark. And thanks to Surfshark, we have the ability to travel and work at cafes from our laptops with the peace of mind knowing that our passwords and data is encrypted and kept safe. Even with public Wi-Fi, it searches and scans for viruses on your device and gives us real-time alerts if there's a data breach, and the cool part is that you can even change your VPN in other countries, allowing you to access even more Netflix movies or even get discounts while shopping online. You can try one of Surfshark's packages for as low as $249 a month, and right now Surfshark is having a VPN deal. Use code BEER to get an additional 3 months for free. Click the link below for more details. Now that all my shingles are put on and my roof is nice and waterproof, I had to router out some windows. This seems really easy to do online, but it's a pain in the ass to do in real life, so I'll probably never do it again, and I don't recommend it. Once I finished with that terrible process, it was time to install the house wrap. And this is a pretty straightforward process. You basically just lay it on the house and nail it in. You start from the bottom and overlap the top layer to make sure no water gets in. Now that the house wrap is on, it's time to install some windows. And I cut the house wrap in a way where I can wrap it around the stud just to try to keep it as dry as possible just in case any water gets in. I used window flashing and wrapped it onto the stud before putting the window on. Then laid a bead of window and door adhesive before installing my window. We picked up our windows from Facebook Marketplace to try and save some money, and they were in pretty much brand new condition, so we went with that. Once the window was in place, I made sure that it was square and level and also opened and closed, then went ahead and nailed it into place. I then repeated the same process to the window right next to it. And I'm not a professional window installer, so if you are and have any recommendations on how I can make the next project a little better, definitely drop a comment down below, because I'd love to learn. The next step was to install the front door, so I did the same thing with the house wrap and cut off the toe kick that was at the bottom because we don't need it. In this tiny home, we're installing French doors that we also picked up from Facebook Marketplace, but they didn't come with a frame, so we had to make one. And what I did is pick up a few 1x4s and try and make the most square frame I can possibly make. Then brought it into the rough opening and fit it into place. Everything seemed to be going really smooth, but of course when you're doing constructions, things can quickly take a turn. I made my door frame a half an inch too big. Unfortunately, I made my door frame a little too big and the door wasn't closing correctly, but after a few adjustments, I got it right. I added some window flashing around the door, and I gotta say, this thing was legitimately starting to look like a tiny home. The next day, it rained a lot. So I took that time to go ahead and make the 4 windows that go at the top. I picked up some glass from Home Depot and cut a dado into the 1x4s, then slid the glass into place. I made sure they were square before nailing them into place, then added a bead of silicone around the inside and the outside of the window to make sure it doesn't leak. After letting the windows sit overnight, it was finally time to install them. So I cut my house wrap and these windows fit inside of there nice and snug, super beautiful. I also made sure to aim the windows outward a little bit so water comes off of that little seal that I made. Then I made sure that they were nice and level and I added a bunch of silicone in between the gaps. And added some window flashing around the windows nice and tight, and I'm pretty confident these windows won't ever leak, especially with the overhang above. And for those who are asking, I did go into the tiny home after and nail them into place to make sure these windows won't ever move. And now that all the windows are installed, it's finally time to install the siding. And for the siding, we're doing board and batten, which is kind of the style right now. And my wife really wanted it, so I really couldn't say no anyways. We basically just put them onto the house, nailed them into place, and used some adhesive to help them stick onto the house a little better. Then did a bunch of measuring so we can cut out the windows, and we triple checked these measurements because these boards are like $50 a sheet and we cannot afford to mess any of them up. Adding these boards to the house was really time consuming because we had to do a lot of measuring, but it was really making this house start to look like a home, which really motivated me to just want to keep going, just so I can see the finished product. Once all the boards were up, it was finally time to add some trim pieces. We measured so the trim pieces can go over the seams to really give this tiny home a nice uniform look. We made sure that the trim pieces were nice and level, then secured them onto the house using finishing nails. And I really wanted to add a wood element to the house, so I decided to add some of this treated tongue and groove pine to one of the corners, going from the bottom all the way to the top. So I measured them and did a bunch of miter cuts, then leveled them out and nailed them into place. Once I finished installing all the pine boards, I went ahead and finished trimming out all my windows, and I did a nice miter cut around all of them to give it a nice professional look. Once I finished installing the trim, I went around and filled in all the nail holes using paintable caulking. And while I did that, Hope started masking off all the doors and windows so we can paint this tiny home. Since all the board and batten that we installed onto this tiny home is already primed, there was no need to prime it, so we went ahead and started to paint it. We're using a paint gun to paint the exterior of this tiny home, and the type of paint that we're using is Behr Dynasty Paint and Primer. This is an exterior paint that we picked up at Home Depot. And the reason we're spraying this on is because it gives you a more professional look and it's much faster to do. After letting the paint dry for about an hour, we went ahead and started taking the masking tape off, and what a beauty. We're so proud of ourselves for being able to build something like this. It was getting late in the day, but out of excitement, we went ahead and decided that we wanted to prime the front door because we really couldn't wait to see how this thing would look. So we did just that and absolutely loved it. The next day, it was time to install the soffit. So I drilled some holes so I can run some wire because we're going to install some puck lights into the soffit. For the soffit, we're installing the same pine boards that we treated earlier to try to keep a nice uniform look. Once we finished installing all of our soffit boards, it was time to drill some holes so we can install our puck lights. I left some extra slack in the wire that I ran earlier and taped it to the roof so when I drill my hole, I don't cut the wire. I connected my wires to the junction box that the lights came with, then clipped them into place and did the same process over and over until all the puck lights were installed. And just like that, the exterior of this tiny home is 95% finished. In the next part of this video, I'm going to be building a deck and bringing you through the step-by-step process of exactly how I finished building the entire interior of this tiny home. Thanks for watching, and God bless.